So as we move into Romans, we are now starting a new genre. Remember, we've been reading the Bible, but the Bible is contains several different genres. In some ways, it's sort of a library. So the rest of the New Testament, or most of the rest of the New Testament, is going to be letters. Sometimes we call these epistles. Epistles. So recall as we finish up Acts, that Acts is sort of the history of the early Christian movement. We follow people like Paul, who were early Christian missionaries, and many of the letters that we read then, Romans, First, Second Corinthians, Thessalonia, that sort of thing. These are letters from Paul or others to some of these churches and to some of these individuals that we read about in Acts. Not all of the books and letters line up perfectly with Acts. I shared in the Facebook page or the Facebook group a little bit of a diagram, a chart for us, but on all of that. But anyway, we're moving into letters now. So I just wanted to share some thoughts before we dive into any particular letters. Um, the most obvious one, I think, for us that we have to wrestle with is that when we read letters, we are reading somebody else's mail. Um, More so than any other books of the Bible. Um, this was not written. These were not written as something that would one day be included in Scripture, right? When Paul was sitting down to write the or dictate the letter to the Romans to the church in Rome, he wasn't thinking, "Oh, there's going to be a guy in Taylorville, Illinois, 2,000 years from now who's going to be reading this as Christian Scripture." He wouldn't have thought that at all. And so we have to wrestle with this because on one hand, this is not intended for me, and then on the other hand, we say it's Scripture, and so it is intended for me. Um, and it's this sort of ongoing tug with all of this. And so, with this in mind, then we have to. It's vitally important for us to attend to the context of these letters. We're talking about particular people, particular times, particular culture, particular cities and places where these things that we're reading about are all taking place. So there's this this tug looks like okay. So there's this bit about eating meat sacrificed to idols and how that's a big deal in one of the letters in a church. And we read that and think, well, I'm not too worried about that, right? Um, it's not for us, and yet it is, right? Um, the Galatians, the church in Galatia, was all worried about circumcision. Not really something we're talking a whole lot about these days. It's not for us, and yet it is for us. Um, so, with that in mind, these aren't just like random theological thoughts, right? These aren't, you know, prayers and hymns and poems like they are in Psalms. These aren't just narratives. They're not just stories like the Gospels. They're not necessarily just laws like the Torah. These are written to teach, challenge, and encourage particular Christian people in particular Christian communities. And often there is a particular issue the writer's addressing. So I just said circumcision, but really the bigger issue in Galatia is legalism. It's, the law says this, we must do exactly that, and missing the bigger picture. In Corinth, the issue is division in the church. And so you have this undertone in these letters about particular things going on in that particular community. The epistles, for the most part, pretty much already assume you know the story of Jesus, um, which is interesting because the Gospels were written almost entirely after the epistles were written. That's a whole different story, but they kind of assume you know the gist of the Jesus story, or at least you're learning it, and they're really more reflections on what Jesus's story means for life, both sort of on micro levels. Hey, Corinth, you've got some division, and macro levels. What does it mean for us to follow Jesus? Something that anybody can take from it. Uh, so, in that way, they're theological. They talk about God, but they're also practical. They're kind of where belief and practice meet in the epistles. We see that really um, in a fuller way than we do in others. So, for instance, 1 Corinthians 11, there's this spiel that Paul goes on about practices of the Lord's Supper, practices of communion, because in his mind they were doing it incorrectly. They were separating the rich and the poor, and we'll get to that when we talk about First Corinthians. Um, but other than the Gospels, other than when Jesus actually sat down to say, "Do this," we don't have any commentary in the Scriptures other than from First Corinthians 11 on the practice of the Lord's Supper, and so it gives us this window into what it looked like for these early Christians. Um, so again, real people, real issues, real context. So sometimes we get this sort of insider language, and we are confronted with these local problems. Again, meat sacrifice to idols, local problem, not my problem. Wrestling, we have to wrestle with what do I do with that as Christian scripture. Um, Notice also tones. So the letters carry personality. Paul wrote a lot of them. You kind of see Paul's tone. You see James's tone. You see um, just the tone of the different writers. They carry personality, right? And so it's good. It's good in all scripture, but maybe particularly in the letters when we're thinking about Christian practices, not just Christian beliefs. What do you hear in between the lines that informs what you read? At different times, the epistles are tender, they're urgent, they're frustrated, they're encouraging, they're all of the above. And so, what this does for us is this gets us really close to the heart of these early Christian leaders. What are they thinking? What are they doing? How are they making sense of Jesus? And just a couple decades after his life, and still trying to figure out Jesus. And then, as an extension of that, we get closer to the heart of God through these. Now, finally, when reading the epistles, when reading letters, they can be somewhat dense. Romans is the epitome of dense. Interesting, deeply interesting, but it may be dense isn't the right word. Maybe confusing might be the right word. Difficult. You got a single sentence that can be packed with so much and written to somebody that's not you in a situation that's not yours. And this single sentence can be packed with all sorts of ideas. So I'm going to invite you as we read together to do your best to attend to chunks, not just sentences. We have this tendency because we divide the Bible into chapters and verses. We have this tendency to like take one single verse and plaster it on our bumper stickers, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have to remember, particularly with the epistles, to attend to the whole thing. Try not to cherry pick, um, because we can easily mislead or be misled, and miss the point, miss what's actually going on if we're not attending to the whole context. Um, and finally, I guess as an extension of that, attend to the flow of an argument. So in Romans, Paul is trying to ask this question of, okay, now that Jesus has come, what do we do with the Jews? Right? I'm Jew. Paul says, I'm a Jew. What's Jesus mean for me? Uh, and so there's a lot of sort of this internal back and forth that he has. And so, especially when you start to see phrases like therefore or so then, there's an argument being made. There's a point being made. And so attend to the whole thing, not just little chunks. Well, I'm glad to read the epistles with you, and I'm looking forward to it. Happy reading.